Welcome to another Top 10 Altered Nostalgic. In this episode, we're going to take a look at the top 10 duos, partners, and pairings in video games. Number 1. Mario and Luigi. First appeared together in Mario Bros. From 1983. After Mario debuted in 1981 against Donkey Kong, his younger brother Luigi debuted and teamed up with a mustached hero a couple of years later. The classic arcade platformer placed the Italian-American plumbers against emerging sewer creatures, flipping them on their backs and kicking them to oblivion. Ever since then, the fraternal twin brothers have starred in many Nintendo games together as a pair, often tackling the same quests and missions in order to save Princess Peach. The iconic Super Mario Bros. Series on the NES and Super Mario World for the Super Nintendo featured the brothers as first and second player choices, and further emphasized Luigi's importance as Mario's sidekick. The pair also starred together in the handheld role-playing Mario and Luigi series for the Game Boy Advance, Nintendo DS, and Nintendo 3DS. While originally designed as a simple palette swap for Mario, Luigi developed into his own protagonist, starring in various Luigi-centered games such as Luigi's Mansion, Dr. Luigi, and New Super Luigi U. While Mario was always the face and star of the Nintendo brand, Luigi was often portrayed as the beta male to Mario's alpha. His nervousness and timid nature is different from Mario's confident and assertive persona, giving contrast between the two similar-looking characters. However, Luigi's powers is just as capable as Mario, often giving him a higher and further jumping ability at the expense of control. Mario and Luigi are undoubtedly the most popular siblings and pairing in video games, inspiring future platformers to feature their own tag team couplets. Number 2. Sonic and Tails. First appeared together on Sonic the Hedgehog 2 from 1992, Sonic and his good buddy Miles Prower, also known as Tails, may seem inseparable today, but Sonic was tackling Dr. Eggman on his own in the first Sonic the Hedgehog. In order to attract new fans and provide Sonic his own in-game partner, Tails was introduced in the 8-bit version of Sonic the Hedgehog 2 for the Sega Master System and the Game Gear. Tails was just a rescue mission for Sonic as a damsel-in-distress type of character, similar to Princess Peach in the Mario Bros. Series. In the Sega Genesis version of Sonic the Hedgehog 2, released later in 1992, Tails became a playable character and can appear on screen with Sonic at the same time. Tails has the unique ability to fly, or at least hover like a helicopter, to complement Sonic's hyper speed. While Sonic is a heroic, short-tempered daredevil, Tails is less courageous, with a more sweet-natured and humble personality. By Sonic 3, the two would have more unique roles as a hero and sidekick, with Tails able to lift and carry Sonic and possessing the ability to swim underwater. Tails would eventually star on his own games from the mid-90s, such as Tails' Sky Patrol and Tails' Adventure on the Sega Game Gear. In later years, the pair would be joined by other characters as the Sonic universe expanded, but Tails would still play an integral role as a helpful ally in Sonic's games, such as Sonic Adventure and Sonic Heroes. As a duo, the legacy of Sonic and Tails is about being the heroic pair of Sega and the faces of Sega Genesis platformers in the early mid-90s. Number 3. Jak and Daxter. First appeared together in Jak and Daxter: The Precursor Legacy in 2001 for PS2. Jak and Daxter ushered in the early 2000s as the spiritual successors to the colorful Crash Bandicoot platformers of the late 90s. The duo were best friends from the very beginning, with Daxter originally being a humanoid person just like his buddy Jak. Early on, Daxter gets exposed to a mysterious matter called Dark Eco, and he transforms into a half-otter, half-weasel creature. The pair tackle their quests throughout the games with playful banter, and their genuine friendship is felt throughout the series. Jak himself went through various transformations in personality, initially being a quiet troublemaker in the first game to brooding and vengeful by the second game, and eventually more level-headed in Jak 3. Daxter was never as heroic as Jak, but he still tagged alongside his buddy to provide comic relief and the occasional assistance. In 2006, Daxter even got his own self-titled game on the PSP where he had to rescue Jak, displaying bravery and determination on his part. Jak and Daxter certainly made their impact as a memorable video game duo, particularly during the 6th generation, and their enjoyable games have gone down in PlayStation history as some of the best platforming exclusives. Number 4. Ratchet and Clank. First appeared together in Ratchet and Clank from 2002 on the PS2. One is a snarky cat alien who uses various weapons and gadgets, and the other is a brainy mini-robot who can act as a jetpack and other transportive functions. Ratchet is a Lombax, a space feline biped who initially wanted to travel beyond his planet and explore other worlds. He comes across Clank, an escaped robot from the planet Quartu, and they became attached partners, aiding each other in various missions and quests. The main goal of the first game is to stop the evil Chairman Drek from destroying other planets, including Ratchet's own home world, Veldin. Clank becomes a technical guide for Ratchet, possessing high intelligence while giving his matter-of-fact delivery and somewhat stuffy way of speaking. Ratchet is more relatable with a strong-willed attitude and caring personality, making the pair a typical hero-slash-nerd combination. Throughout the series, the duo travel to various worlds and confront enemies, saving the planet with their unique weapons as a sci-fi tag team. Clank eventually got his own spin-off game, Secret Agent Clank, for the PSP in 2008, even rescuing Ratchet in the storyline. Their games often received good critical praise, particularly the earlier PS2 titles, as fun and challenging titles with variety in gameplay. Number 5. Joe and Mac. First game together was Joe and Mac from 1991 on the arcades, Super Nintendo, and Sega Genesis. One of the best Super Nintendo games from my childhood, the original Joe and Mac was an underrated platformer full of action, great music, and crazy boss battles. The two protagonists, Joe with the green hair and Mac with blue hair, are basically caveman ninja who fight dinosaurs and other prehistoric creatures. The two began their quest to save the beautiful cave babes after being kidnapped by enemies and use various weapons such as clubs, boomerangs, fire, and the stone wheel. While some may just dismiss the two caveman characters as Mario and Luigi ripoffs, particularly their presentation and character designs, Joe and Mac featured solid gameplay and fun multiplayer. Yep, the best part of Joe and Mac was tackling the game together with a friend and fighting the giant dinosaur bosses in co-op mode. I always thought the two were brothers as a kid, but even today I'm not really sure if they're actually related. The game had a direct Super Nintendo sequel called Joe and Mac 2 Lost in the Tropics, although another game called Congo's Caper was released and it was related to the Joe and Mac games presented as a sequel in Japan. Joe and Mac 2 Lost in the Tropics was another underrated gem from the 16-bit era, and this time, Joe and Mac had to retrieve the village crown stolen by an evil caveman named Gork. As the most reliable and badass ninja caveman of all time, Joe and Mac will lay the smackdown on dinosaurs and evil bad guys in order to save the day. Number 6. Blue Knight and Yellow Knight. First appeared together in 1982 for the arcade game Joust. Where would multiplayer video games be without Joust? The classic early 80s arcade game featured two knights riding a flying ostrich or a stork, attempting to defeat waves of enemy knights riding vultures. The game can be played in friendly co-op mode, where you complete the stages together, or in competitive mode, with the ability to damage each other along with the enemies. A highly influential title from Williams Electronics, Joust is one of those early 80s video games that spawned a range of other games which would go on to snowball effect the entire industry, with other titles that featured multiplayer, co-op, and deathmatches. The gameplay itself is fun and innovative, with the flapping physics and unique multiplayer standing out from other games during its time. It's easy to forget these older games from the early 80s, particularly if you never grew up in that era, but it's important to recognize these two knights, Yellow and Blue, as the ostrich-riding, high-flying duo of innovation and gaming influence. Number 7. Donkey Kong and Diddy Kong. First appeared together in Donkey Kong Country from 1994 on Super Nintendo. The gorilla character Donkey Kong has been around since the early 80s, but it wasn't until the mid-90s when he was redesigned for a new platforming game called Donkey Kong Country. Along with tweaks added to the character, he was given a nephew named Diddy Kong, also acting as his trusty sidekick. The pair tackled the reptilian Kremlings in order to take back their stolen banana horde, and the game was a smash hit, moving over 9 million copies as the second best-selling Super Nintendo game of all time. The first Donkey Kong Country and the related series Donkey Kong Land on the Game Boy would receive a couple of more sequels and adaptations throughout the years, but the pair themselves would not team up together again until Donkey Kong 64 in 1999 for the Nintendo 64. Diddy Kong himself got a kart racing game in 1997 called Diddy Kong Racing, featuring a few new characters we would later see in upcoming games for the N64. Both Donkey and Diddy would be featured in other franchises such as the Smash Bros. And Mario Kart series, even getting their own CG animated series in the late 90s, which was alright for a younger audience. I remember watching that. The pair would ultimately come back to where they belong, the platforming stage with the more recent Donkey Kong Country Returns series. Donkey Kong and Diddy became two of Nintendo's most beloved mascots, particularly because of Diddy's likable sidekick persona and the small man/big man dynamic. Number 8. Banjo and Kazooie. First appeared together in 1998. One of the best 3D platforming games on the N64, Banjo Kazooie was not the first appearance of Banjo, the brown bear. He debuted on the aforementioned Diddy Kong Racing, but when he received his own game, Kazooie was introduced as his trusty partner. A red-colored bird, Kazooie would hide in Banjo's backpack, acting as a pseudo-weapon and transport system, being able to shoot eggs, use peck attack, and occasionally fly high into the sky. Banjo would consist most of the traveling and combat, but both characters remain attached throughout the games. Their games usually consisted of collecting items, exploring large stages, and ultimately trying to defeat the evil witch Gruntilda. Other titles such as Banjo Pilot involve vehicular competition similar to Diddy Kong Racing, and the Xbox 360 exclusive Banjo Kazooie Nuts and Bolts, which focus more on building vehicles and transportation instead of traditional platforming. As a duo, the pair is memorable just by their unusual name alone, often bantering back and forth in the games like an old couple who can't seem to get rid of each other. While they haven't been as prominent in recent years, those first couple of N64 titles were some of the greatest three-dimensional platform adventure games in the world at the time. With great music, great graphics, and imaginative worlds to explore, the original Banjo Kazooie is a must-have game during the late 90s. Number 9. Ryu and Ken. First appeared together in Street Fighter from 1987 on the arcades. Ryu and Ken are synonymous with fighting games and represent a classic competitive duo in video games, with their enduring friendship and rivalries continuing throughout the Street Fighter series. It's hard to imagine the fighting game genre without these two characters. Unlike most of the pairings in this list, Ryu and Ken primarily operate in solitary fights either against each other or other opponents, considering the nature of fighting games. However, it's their bond in history together as combatants that resonates so well after all these years. We know they trained together, knew each other well, and pursued similar goals with facing the toughest fighters around the world. Put it this way, if Capcom released a Street Fighter game with Ryu included but missing Ken, or vice versa, it would feel very weird, as if the game was incomplete. When you think of fighting games, when you think of the Street Fighter franchise, you can't help but think of the first two characters that come to mind, Ryu and Ken. Two best friends, two rivals, and they defined fighting games in the past 25-26 years. Number 10. Billy and Jimmy Lee. First came out in 1987 for the arcades. Double Dragon starring Billy and Jimmy Lee was one of the most influential beat-em-ups in history. Double Dragon starring Billy and Jimmy Lee was one of the most successful arcade games in history. Double Dragon starring Billy and Jimmy Lee was one of the most ported games in history, reaching various consoles and systems such as the NES, the PC, Atari 2600, Game Boy, Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, Neo Geo, PS1, Atari Lynx, Game Boy Advance, iPhone, Xbox 360, PS3, Android, and PS4. If you haven't played the original Double Dragon, what is wrong with you? Actually, that's fine, considering that there's 5,000 other beat-em-ups we've seen over the years follow its formula. From Streets of Rage and Final Fight, River City Ransom, Battletoads, Golden Axe. The legacy of Billy and Jimmy Lee's adventure influenced so many other games over the years. Double Dragon was truly meant to be enjoyed in co-op multiplayer, fighting through hordes of enemies in the gang-ridden turf of the Black Warriors. As a duo, Billy and Jimmy would continue their melee combat conquests in later sequels during the late 80s and early 90s, even getting their own animated TV show that I actually enjoyed as a kid back in the mid-90s. They even had a live-action movie in 1994, ultimately reaching a peak in commercial exposure. Billy and Jimmy Lee were the archetypical duo of beat-em-ups, twin brothers who kicked ass and influenced an entire generation of hand-to-hand combat games. So that's it. Those are the top 10 duos, pairings, tag team partners in gaming history, whether they're siblings, brothers, best friends, heck, just paired up for the sake of chemistry. This was the top 10 greatest duos in gaming history. Thanks for watching. This has been another episode of the Top 10 Altered Nostalgic. You can check out more videos, check out the channel, youtube.com/TheReviewSpace. And until next time, ciao.